A firm has a debt to equity ratio of 1. Oh my goodness. Is that actually possible? Yeah, 50% debt, 50% equity. Does that make sense? Okay, its cost of equity is 17.4%, and its pre-tax cost of debt is 7.2%. Assume there are no taxes for other imperfections. What would be the cost of equity if the debt to equity ratio were 0? Okay, well, it looks like we've got some stuff that we need to think through here. First of all, step number 1. This is my problem-solving thing, right? We find out what they're asking for. They're asking for the cost of equity if the debt to equity ratio were 0. And so what they're really asking for is the required return on the assets. Does that make sense? They're looking for the required return on the assets. Well, we know that the required return for the assets on a firm is the same as its weighted average cost of capital, especially when there are no taxes. And so one of the things that we're going to do here as we read through is to note all the assumptions. What do they assume? No taxes, no imperfections. Okay, now, so we're also going to identify the given info. We've been given out information on the capital structure. So we've got the debt to equity ratio, which we can use that to figure out the total debt ratio. If we needed that, we could also figure out what I call the total equity ratio. They tell us the cost of equity is 17.4%, and the pre-tax cost of debt is 7.2%. Assume there are no other taxes or imperfections. What would be the cost of equity if the debt to equity ratio were 0? Okay, now we've got all that information. So now we're on to determining the key equation. Let's take a look at the handout that I gave you. You guys still have that, or did you lose it? So we're probably going to be zeroing in on one of these equations. Which one do you think it's going to be? By the way, there are 2 with taxes and 2 without taxes. Based on the assumptions, which one are we zeroing in on? No taxes. So that brings us down to 2 of these to get us in the general neighborhood. Which one of those, knowing what we know, which one of those looks like it's going to be the equation that we need to use? Oh, come on. Yeah, Modigliani and Miller, proposition 2, no taxes. And that equation is R sub S is equal to R sub O. And then we have plus the debt to equity ratio. By the way, B over S is the debt to equity ratio. And then they've got R sub 0 minus R sub B. Let's see if we know these things. Do we know the required return on stock? Oh, give me a break.
Yeah, so it was.
Yeah, it's the cost of equity, right? 0.174. Do we know R sub 0, or is that what we're looking for? That's what we're looking for, right? Plus, what's the debt to equity ratio?
0.
1. Because we're going to start out, right? We start out with 1. Boy, that makes life really easy. And we're going to multiply by, we still don't know R sub 0. Okay. Questions so far? So here we go. We've got 0.174. Oh, and do we know R sub B? 0.072, is that correct? Okay. So, let's say is equal to R sub 0. And then what am I going to do with this algebra over here? What's 1 times R sub 0?
R sub 0.
R sub 0. and then minus 0.072. Are you with me so far? Okay, now I'm going to collect terms. And here's what I think is going on here. You tell me, you've got a calculator, you can tell me 0.246. Is that right? You guys have a calculator. You don't know? Oh yeah, you don't have a calculator. Okay, so those of you who did remember your calculators, can you add together 0.174 and 0.072? And what do you get? 0.246. Does it amaze you that I can do that in my head? It's too real. You can't deny it. Okay, yeah, I can do all sorts of crap in my head. But you guys need to work on it. Okay, now, when I add these two together, what do I get? 2r sub 0. Now, one last step. Mr. Stiff, what do I need to do?
Divide by 2.
Yeah, divide both sides by 2, and when I do, I get r sub 0 is equal to 0.123, which is 12.3%. What will trash most people on this? The fact that the unknown shows up twice. Now notice I did this as algebra light as one could possibly get it. And how did I do that? Instead of trying to solve for r sub 0 up front, because I know you guys aren't really capable of that, or some of you aren't, what did I do? I plugged in all the numbers I knew instead, and I boiled it down to where we only had the unknown and numbers. Does that make sense? So this is your low algebra way to solve this problem.
I guess I'm kind of confused about the wording. So R sub S is cost of levered equity, whereas R sub 0 is the cost of unlevered equity.
Right.
How do you tell the difference in that? Because
Okay.
the way that I'm reading that is just.
So it says if the debt to equity ratio were 0. If the debt to equity ratio is 0, is that levered equity or unlevered equity? Mind blown? If there's no debt, there's no leverage. Questions? Excellent. Okay, so now let's go to number 8, and we'll see if it's the one we thought it was. Hover Corp. Oh, by the way, so we go down here to the bottom. What's that? No. You go down the bottom, and what's it? So step number 1 is find out what they're asking for. What are they asking for here? The levered cost of equity. We've been calling that R sub S. Very good. Its unlevered cost of equity is 12.15%. What have we been calling that? R sub 0. The debt to equity ratio is 1.4. The pre-tax cost of debt is 7.5%. The corporate tax rate is 21%. What is the company's levered cost of equity? Okay, let's go. We're going to figure out what equation we need here. Go back to your sheet. Do we have taxes? Yes. And so that's going to put us with proposition 2 with corporate taxes. I'm going to erase all this so we can put some more stuff on here. Okay, just make sure I get it right. R sub S. That's our cost of levered equity is equal to R sub 0. That's our cost of unlevered equity plus B over S. What's another name for that thing? B over S. Yeah, so debt to equity ratio multiplied by 1 minus T sub C multiplied by R sub 0 minus R sub B. And they're asking us for the levered cost of equity. Do we need to do any algebra whatsoever? No, man, this thing's already solved for it, right? And so what we can do is just plug and chug. What is the unlevered cost of the equity? Yeah, 0.1215 plus, what's the debt to equity ratio? 1.4. Multiplied by 1 minus T sub C. What's T sub C? Well, yeah.
1%, right?
Yeah, 0.21, it's 0.21, so we're gonna say this is 0.79. Can I get an agreement that 1 minus 0.21 is 0.79? Okay, and then we're gonna multiply by the unlevered cost of the equity, which we've already seen once. It's 12.15, so we're gonna say 0.1215 minus the required return on debt, which is the pre-tax cost of debt, that is 0.075. Oh my goodness. How would I go about solving this? Well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start right here. Why do you think I'm starting here? PEMDAS! Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. I can only assume she farted. And why do I say something so crass? So you will remember, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. What's the P stand for?
Parentheses.
Very good. What's the E stand for?
Exponents.
Exponents. What's the M stand for?
Math.
Math. Oh, shit. We were doing so great here. Miss Griffin, what does the M stand for? Multiply. And then what's the D stand for? Divide. A. And then S is subtract. So, we're going to start with the parenthesis here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and get my TIBA2 plus here. I suggest you do this thing. And I'm going to say 0.1215 minus 0.075. What do you get? Shout it out.
0.0465.
Very good. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is multiply by these numbers. So I'm going to multiply by 0.79 equals, what do you get?
0.036735.
Very good, 0.036735. And then I'm going to multiply by 1.4. I get 0.051429. Now, you could try to be tricky and just add that. But sometimes, bless you, sometimes we've got to do work over here. So what I would do if we did have to do work over there is I would say stow 1. What does stow 1 do? Yeah, it stores it in location 1. Now, because it is just adding, I'm going to say plus 0.1215 equals. I'm getting 0.172929, which would be 17.29%. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, was that the question that you were interested in? Who was that? That's for 8. Was that the question you were interested in?
Yes.
Very good. Okay. Other questions about the homework? To tell you what I'm going to do, I'm going to, we'll put all of them up there, and we'll look at them one at a time. Motowalla Markets is an all-equity firm. Mr. Stoner, if you recognize one that you had trouble with, let us know. Motowalla Markets is an all-equity firm that has 500,000 shares outstanding. The company is in the process of borrowing $2.2 million at 5% to repurchase 40,000 of the shares outstanding the firm's outstanding shares. Ignore taxes. What will be the market value of the equity after the repurchase? What do you think the first thing we do is?
Divide 2.2 million by 40,000
Yeah, and why are we doing that?
to see how much each share costs.
Yep, to see how much each share costs. Now, how many shares are going to be outstanding after we do that?
460.
Yeah, 460,000, and we're going to multiply that by 55, and that's going to give me 25.3 million. Not a big problem there. The biggest trick was to figure out that what you need to do is figure out the share price just using this information about the repurchase. Questions?
Is the interest rate on questions like this included just to throw people off?
So here's what goes on in finance, and this is a common question, and that is, why do you give us more information than we need? And the answer is because in real life, we have actually less information than what we need. If I gave you less information than what you needed, you would hunt me down and try to break my legs. But I can give you more information and let you think through it. You could look through this one and work your way through here, and you would realize that that information is not necessary at all as you're working through that. Let me say that one more time in English. Not every number you are given will always be used in the calculation. Does that make sense? Okay. Let's look at number 2. Shaw Software is an unlevered firm with a total market value of $700,000 and 35,000 shares of stock outstanding. What could I do with those two pieces of information?
What's that price?
Yeah, you can find the stock price. Firm has an expected EBIT of 42,000 if the economy is in normal and 80,000 if the economy booms. The firm is considering a bond issue of 96,000 with an attached interest rate of 7.4%. The bond proceeds will be used to repurchase shares. Ignore taxes. What will be the earnings per share after the repurchase if the economy booms? Okay, so they give me EBIT, and it's 42,000 bucks. Now, in an unlevered firm, there is no interest. But now, do we have interest? How much is the interest? Yeah, so I'm going to take 0.074 times 96,000. That's going to give me 7,104. Okay, now they're saying, what's the assumption? They say ignore taxes, so do we have to worry about taxes here? No. And so my EBT, in this case, is equal to the net income because there are no taxes. And so all I have to do, I'm going to hit the plus minus button, plus 42,000. That gives me 34,896. Okay, now what are they asking for? Yeah, what's the earnings per share after the repurchase if the economy booms? Oh, wait a minute. I did 42,000. I need to do 80,000, right? Does that make sense? So that brings us to 72,896, is that right? These things just come to me. I don't know if they're right or not. Is that right? Okay. So now, what we need to do is figure out the number of shares outstanding after the repurchase. So we know from the very beginning that 700,000 divided by 35,000 is our stock price. So that's going to tell us it's $20 per share. The question is, how many shares can you repurchase with $96,000? How can we figure that out? Say it out loud, please.
96,000 divided by 20.
Very good. 96,000 divided by 20. I'm getting 4,800. And so what I would do if I were you is I would just hit the plus minus button there and I would add that original 35,000 back. I'm getting 30,200 shares. Is that right? 30,200. Now, we've got this number here. and I've got the number of shares in my calculator. Here's what, there are two things I could do. I could store this number and then divide by it. Or I could just hit this 1 over x key. Do you see it? It's 2 buttons above the number 9. 2 buttons above the number 9. I'm going to hit the 1 over the x, and then I'm going to multiply by 72896. I'm getting $2.41, which is the correct answer. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay. Actually, I should probably stop working every one of them, just ask you if you had any problems with this one. A firm has zero debt and an overall cost of capital of 11.7%. Would that also be the unlevered equity return? Yeah. Firm is considering a new capital structure with 45% debt and an interest rate of 6.8%. Assume there are no taxes or other imperfections. What will be the levered cost of equity? So they're asking for the levered cost of equity. Go back to your sheet here and ask yourself, which one of these formulas will we be using? Proposition 2, we have taxes or none? No taxes, and so we're looking at R sub S is equal to R sub 0 plus the debt to equity ratio times R sub 0 minus R sub B. Do they give us the debt to equity ratio? No! What do they give us?
No. Okay.
Total debt ratio, right? What the hell am I supposed to do with that? How do I get from that to the debt to equity ratio? Ooh, very good. She says that total equity over total assets must be 1 minus 0.45, which gives us 0.55. Is that correct? Aha. And then, what's the final step to get to the debt to equity ratio? Second? Solve for it. Well, of course. Yeah. What if I take TD over TA and divide by TE over TA? What happens to the over TAs? Yeah, they cancel out. What do we have left? Yeah, so it's just 0.45 divided by 0.55. That is the only thing tricky about that question. Questions? Sewing World. Let's see, they're asking for the firm's levered debt to equity ratio if you ignore taxes. So we know we're probably going to be using M&M Proposition 2, no taxes. Sewing World has an all equity cost of capital, a levered cost of equity, pre-tax cost of debt of 6.8, and they're asking for the debt to equity ratio. Out of that whole formula, what are they asking for? Are they asking for R sub S? No. Are they asking for R sub 0 or R sub O? No. Are they asking for R sub B? They gave us all that stuff. What are they asking for?
B over S.
Yeah, they're asking for B over S. And when you solve for that number, so you could just, instead of putting B over S in there and confusing yourself, you could write D over E, or you could just make it X, whatever you wanted to do, and solve for that thing, and that will give you the levered debt to equity ratio. Questions? Okay. I think we just... Oh, that's the same one. Never mind. Okay, here we go. What would be its cost of equity if the debt to equity ratio were 0? Gee, what kind of number is that? Is that R sub S? It's R sub 0, right? That is the unlevered cost of equity. What would the cost of equity be if the debt to equity were 0? And by the way, we've already talked about that one, right? So I'm going to skip it. Border Crossing has no debt and a cost of capital of 12.2%. That is your unlevered equity required return. So that would be R sub 0. The shareholders would prefer to earn a rate of 16.4%. So what's the debt to equity ratio required to meet the shareholders' preference if the firm pays no taxes and can borrow at 6.2%? What are we trying, so what is 16.4% out of those variables that we've got in Proposition 2, no taxes? What is 16.4%? Very good, it's R sub S. And we are going to be trying to find the debt to equity ratio, and then they give us one more piece of information. What is 6.2%? Yeah, it's R sub B. And so if we go in there and we just plug all that into equation, or to Proposition 2, no taxes, and just solve for B over S, we'll be good to go. Questions? Chuffy's has a target debt to equity ratio of 1.26, has a cost of equity of 14.5%. Are we talking, this cost of equity, are we talking unlevered or levered? It has to be levered, right? Because we're looking at a debt to equity ratio of 1.26. Its pre-tax cost of debt is 9%, its tax rate is 21%. What's the company's weighted average cost of capital? Well, I believe if we just go back to our old, and hopefully you guys learned this in 380 whatnot, we have our RWAC formula. You guys remember RWAC? It's equal to debt over the value of the firm times the required return on debt times 1 minus the corporate tax rate, and I'm probably writing this backward from the way you're used to seeing it, plus E over V times the required return on equity. So let's start walking through this and see what numbers we already know. Do we know the required return on the debt? Yeah, it's 9%. Now, they said this is the before tax cost of debt. If they said it was the after tax cost of debt, I would substitute it in for this whole thing, right? Because this is the after tax cost of debt. This is the before tax cost of debt. Does that make sense? Because this is our taxes. Okay, so we've got 0.09, is that right? Yeah. Okay, multiply by 1 minus 0.21, which we said was 0.79. And then I'm going to multiply by D over V here, plus, what's the required return on the equity?
14.5%.
Yeah, 14.5%. I'm going to say 0.145. Now the question is, how do I get to D over V and E over V given the information that they've given me? What piece of information have they given me that's going to allow me to do that? What piece of information in that problem is going to allow me to figure out my total debt ratio and my total equity ratio? Yeah, the debt to equity. Now here's the trick I'm going to show you. The equity multiplier is equal to total assets over total equity. But we also know one other thing about the equity multiplier. This is equal to 1 plus total debt over total equity. And so I could easily figure out that my debt to equity is 1.26. I add 1, that's 2.26. And so all I have to do to get what I would call the total equity ratio, TE over TA, what do I need to do with that number? If I'm just flipping this thing. If I flip this, what do I have to do over here? Well, folks, it's just plain old algebra, Mr. Stoner. Yeah, and how do I flip it? Multiply, no.
Take the inverse.
Yes, take the inverse. And so TE over TA is 1 over 1.26. Does that make sense? Oh, actually, it's 2.26, right? So I just flipped it. 1 over 2.26. Now, how do I go about getting the total debt ratio? Well, we know that the total equity and this piece and this piece, what do they have to add together to be? I'll give you a hint. D plus E is equal to V. D over V plus E over V is V over V. What's V over V?
1.
1! So they always have to add to 1. So if I'm going to take, I've got this one here, and then I'm going to have something over that's going to be equal to, let's make it easy for you. I'm going to subtract from 1 here, but I'm going to write 1 like this. Is that 1? Yeah. And then I'm going to subtract 1 over 2.26, which is that total equity over total assets. And what does that leave me with? Yeah, 1.26 over 2.26. So that is our TD over TA. And so we'll plug that into the formula right here. 1.26 divided by 2.26. And then over here, it's 1 over 2.26. Can you guys do the math from that? The big thing that I showed you here is how to get from debt to equity to these weights. Did you guys catch that? So let's talk about what these numbers actually are. This is the debt to equity ratio. Do you recognize it? And this is 1 plus the debt to equity ratio. Does that make sense? Now, what does this mean over here? This is just 1 over 1 plus the debt to equity ratio. And so if I were you, what I would have written on my note sheet, by the way, this is a very strong hint. Are you ready? TD over TA equals the debt to equity ratio divided by 1 plus the debt to equity ratio. TE over TA is equal to 1 over 1 plus the debt to equity ratio. Now just to check our work, if I add 1 and DE together, what do I get? 1 plus DE. What is 1 plus DE over 1 plus DE? Oh, come on, this isn't calculus, folks. It's just 1. And that's exactly what we said these things have to add to. Does that make sense? Everybody got this written down? That should go on your note sheet. Okay, we've already done number 8. So they're asking the firm's levered cost of capital if they undertake a new capital structure. So they start with an unlevered firm. And we see that there are taxes. Which formula are we going to be using? Oh, come on.
Proposition 2 with taxes.
Yeah, Proposition 2 with taxes. And if it's currently got no debt in its capital structure, that cost of capital is the same as the unlevered cost of equity, and that would be R sub 0. 12.46%. Tax rate's 35%. The firm's considering a new capital structure with 35% debt. The interest rate on the debt would be 6.68%. What would the firm's levered cost of capital, well, what is the firm's levered cost of capital? That's going to be, well, we're going to have to find R sub S, right? Yeah. It should be levered cost of equity, shouldn't it? It should be levered cost of equity. If they undertake this new capital structure. So, the only thing that we have here that is not a direct drop-in is the debt to equity ratio. But they've given us this capital structure that's 35% debt. And so we've got TD over TA is equal to 0.35. What does that make TE over TA? What do I plug in here? Come on, I have to add 2. We've done this like just minutes ago. TD over TA plus TE over TA always equals 1, because TD plus TE is TA. Has to be. So 1 minus 0.35 at this point gives us 0.65. Now I just take TD over TA and put it over TE over TA, and it's 0.35 divided by 0.65. And now you just plug and chug. Questions? Houston Tools has expected earnings before interest and taxes of $189,400, unlevered cost of capital of 12.87%. So they're asking what's the value of the firm. And they've got a tax rate there. So they're asking what is the value of the levered firm. So the value of the levered firm is equal to the value of the unlevered firm plus T sub C times B. Do you guys see that anywhere on your formula sheet? Okay, so now what we need to do is figure out what is the value of the unlevered firm and then this stuff here. So let's see what we've got. We know that they've got earnings before interest and taxes of $189,400. Do we have enough information to figure out what the interest is? Actually, do we even need to do that? Because if you look at the tax shield definition of this, the value of the levered firm is equal to EBIT times 1 minus T sub C plus T sub C times R sub B times B. Did I get that right? Or do you guys even know? So here's what they're doing. Oh, okay, so we're looking for the value of the unlevered firm. So I'm going to erase this. So the value of the unlevered firm is we're looking at EBIT times 1 minus T sub C. That's going to be the amount of money that the unlevered firm gets every year. Can you see that? If this were EBT, it would be perfectly clear. Why do I not need to worry about the I here? Yeah, it's unlevered, right? And so if I just take that EBIT times 1 minus T sub C, and then, remember, one of the assumptions is that the tax flows, or the cash flows, go on forever. You remember this formula here? The present value of an annuity, or a perpetuity, is C over R. This is our C. And what is the expected return on the unlevered firm? Can you tell me from, you see it? What's the expected return on the unlevered firm? Ms. Griffin? So it would be the 12.87%? You see that? Unlevered cost of capital is 12.87. If there's no debt, that also has to be the cost of capital, or the cost of unlevered equity. Okay, so that's what we're going to plug in here. And so our EBIT is 189,400, is that right? Multiply by, what's the tax rate here? 34. So I'm going to have 0.66. Do you guys see how I got 1 minus 0.34 to be 0.66? And then I'm going to divide by the unlevered cost of capital, which is 0.1287. So let's go ahead and do that together with our calculators. 189,400 times 0.66 equals, I'm getting 125,004. Okay, now I'm going to divide that by 0.1287. And I'm getting $971,282.05. So I'm going to store that in location 1. And so now we have this. So all we have to do is figure out this part. T sub C, we said, is 0.35. And how much are they borrowing? How much did they borrow? 318,000. So I'm going to say 0.35 times 318,123 equals, I'm getting 111,300. Is that what you guys get? Okay, now I'm going to add, recall 1, I'm getting 1.082. How come our numbers aren't the same? Did I use the wrong tax rate? Say again?
I think you said 0.35.
Ah, that's it, I used the wrong tax rate. Okay, so 0.34 times 318,000 equals, plus, recall 1. I'm getting $1,079,402.05. Okay, now let's see what we can glean out of this. Oh, I wanted to explain to you one more time. Why is that the present value of the tax shield? Because what we're saying here is the value of the levered firm is equal to the value of the unlevered firm plus the present value of the tax shield. And we are making the assumption that the cash flows go on here forever. So what is the annual amount of that tax shield? Well, it's going to be your tax rate, bless you, times your amount of debt times the required return on that debt. But that's just the C part. Then I have to divide by the required rate of return to get the present value. Well, what's the required rate of return? Don't we already know it? We're going to put that down here below. And what happens to R sub B? Oh, come on. What's R sub B over R sub B? It's 1. These things just cancel out, right? And so that's why this thing is the present value of the tax shields. Question? Okay, let's go ahead and try to knock out those practice questions. And let's start with number 28. Proposition 2, without taxes implies that the required return on equity is it a result of homemade leverage? I mean, one of the ways you can work this is to eliminate stuff, right? Inversely related to the firm's debt to equity ratio. Well, if you look at the formula, it says it's directly related. So what they're asking about here, the required return on equity, R sub S, at the levered firm, is not inversely, but is directly related, right? Because what does that mean? It means as the debt to equity ratio goes up, so does the required return on equity. And the reason behind that is because a firm with more debt is a riskier firm. The equity is riskier, therefore you require a higher return. Does that make sense? Okay, independent of the firm's capital structure? No. A linear function of the market interest rate. Do we see the market interest rate anywhere in this? No. Okay, so that's number 28. Let's move on to number 48. VU Games and Game On are identical firms except for their capital structures. Actually, we worked this one last time, didn't we? VU Games is an unlevered firm with $680,000 of equity. Game On is a levered firm with $425,000 of equity and $255,000 of debt. At an interest rate of 6.2%, both VU Games and Game On have an expected EBIT of $84,000, ignore taxes, and they're asking us for the weighted average cost of capital. Okay, so weighted average cost of capital, if VU is an unlevered firm, the required return on equity is exactly the same as the required return on its assets is exactly the same as the weighted average cost of capital. What is the required return on VU Games? Well, we're getting $84,000 a year out of it. By the way, do they tell us to ignore taxes? They do, right? And so that's why we can take this $84,000. What kind of return is it giving us? It's giving us $84,000. Divide by, how much did we have to invest to get that? $680,000. And so that's going to be our unlevered WACC, which would also be R sub 0. Okay, so now knowing that, we can use that information to figure out what is the required return for Game On. Which of the formulas on your sheet? Well, first of all, are we talking taxes or no taxes? No taxes. So that narrows it down. Now we're down to Proposition 2, no taxes. R sub S is equal to R sub 0, which is going to be this number right here, plus the debt to equity ratio. Do we know the debt to equity ratio? Can we calculate it? Yeah, 255,000 divided by 425,000 is our debt to equity ratio. Multiplied by R sub 0, which once again is this number, minus R sub B. What's R sub B here?
6.2.
Yeah, 6.2%. So that's how we would go about solving that problem. Who asked for that one? No one's going to confess. Okay. Because I want to make sure that you understand. Raise your hand if you don't understand. Okay.
I do have a question about it.
Yeah, go ahead.
You didn't need to do the levered firm because in a world with no taxes, you can just do unlevered is equal to the levered firm, right?
Okay, so we started out, we figured out the return on the unlevered firm. So we would have the information then to solve for the return on the levered firm because it's part of what we need. It's R sub 0, right?
Okay.
And so if you started using my thing here, find out what they're asking for. They're asking for the required return on a levered firm, and then you start looking for what do you need to do that. And so if you get down here to looking at the key equations, you know which one it is. And they've given you the required return on the debt. They've given you the B, they've given you the S. What's the only thing they haven't given you? The required return on the unlevered equity or the required return on the assets of the firm. So that's R sub 0. And so what you're going to do is say, well, how could I find that then? Well, hey, fortunately, they've given you the unlevered information so you can calculate that. Other questions? Okay, now we are on to number 55. Alto and Tenor have 17,400 shares of stock outstanding at a market price of $27 per share. The firm also has $140,000 of 6.2% bonds outstanding that are selling at par. What does par mean, selling at par? How much are they worth each? Yeah, 1,000. The firm does not expect to pay taxes for the foreseeable future. The cost of equity is 15.3%. What is the value of RWAC? So we've got, we can figure out the amount of equity. Which do you guys prefer, E or S? You don't care? Okay. E is equal to, how are we going to calculate the market value of the equity?
Shares outstanding times price per share.
Yeah, shares outstanding, cash price per share. 17,400 times 27, is that right? Is that correct? Okay. Now, how do we figure out the market value of the debt? They could have told us that there were 140 bonds outstanding selling at par. Right? 140,000 and they're selling at par. So that's actually the market value of the debt. What if they've been selling at 97%, at 0.97? What would you do? You just multiply that number by 0.97, right? Or they could have said they're selling at a 3% discount to par, which would have been take that number times 0.97. But because they're selling at par, we don't have to do that. Now we know for WAC, do I still have it up here? No, let's go. Our WAC is equal to equity over the total value of the firm. By the way, what's the total value of the firm here? That's got to add those two things together, right? E over V times the required return on equity plus D over V times the required return on debt times 1 minus T. Do we have, oh no, what do they say? No taxes. They don't expect to pay taxes for the foreseeable future, so there's no taxes here. And so this is going to be our formula. In fact, I'll go ahead and write that 1 minus T. And then we're going to say that's 0, so this whole thing just goes away. Okay. Now, we're going to go ahead and figure out what is this equity. 17,400 times 27. I'm getting 469,800. So I'm going to store that in location 1. And then I'm going to add 140,000 bucks. That gives me V. I'm going to store that in location 2. How would I calculate E over V here? I'll get you started. Recall 1 divide by, yeah, recall 2. And I'm getting 0.7704. 0.7704. Does that make sense? Yes, because this number is a lot larger than this number. Okay, so this is, and I'm going to store that in location 3. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put a 3 here and circle that. So I'll remember where I stuck it. Now, I could just take, subtract 1 from that and see that this one is going to be 0.2296. But I'm going to do it the hard way. I'm going to say 140,000, 1, 2, 3, divide by, recall what? Where did we have this stored? So we had this in 2, right? Divide by, recall 2. I'm getting 0.22958, which is what I got otherwise. I'm going to store that in location 4. And when I do that, I'm going to write a little 4 and a circle there. Okay. Now, we can go ahead and plug this other stuff in. What do they say the required return on the equity is? Oh, come on, you can just read it, right? 15.3%. By the way, when you're doing it this way, you can either leave these as percentages or decimals. Can you leave that one as a percentage? No, always got to be a decimal. And so 15.3%, and then what is the required return on the debt? 6.2%. Now, notice that that is actually the coupon rate. And what we're looking for is the yield to maturity. What information did they give us that allows us to know that the coupon rate is equal to the yield to maturity? Say again? Yeah, they're selling at par. We know that bonds only sell at par when their coupon rate is equal to the yield to maturity. Does that make sense? Okay, so here we go. I've still got this one in my calculator, so I'm going to multiply by 6.2 equals, and I'm going to store that in location 5. And then I'm going to say recall 3 times 15.3% equals, I'm going to store that in location 6 just in case everything goes horribly wrong. And then what do I do? Come on, just two things I've got to add together, right? Recall, let me just start here. Recall, Mr. Bash.
Call 6 plus recall 5.
Yeah. I'm getting 13.21%. And that's the answer. Okay. I hear the bells are playing, so we know we're past noon. Any other questions? Can you see that you have a need to practice these? Do you think it might be smart to write down the problem-solving steps? Did you find those helpful at all? Yeah. And I always have trouble remembering to do it. I should run right to the end and see what they're asking for. Because sometimes that helps me to know what I do need and what I don't need. And so there will be some garbage that they throw in there and I'm like, whew, not going to need that. Questions?
So one of the questions was a key assumption of MM position 1 is that an individual can borrow as cheaply as a corporation.
That's
Didn't
true.
we talk in class that corporations are charged more interest than an individual?
Yeah, but in order for it to hold, all it has to be is that the individual can replicate it at least as cheaply. And so what we're saying here is that the corporation doesn't have any advantage in borrowing. Because what the argument was prior to Modigliani and Miller was, well, it's a lot easier for corporations to borrow than for individual people. And then Modigliani and Miller come along and say, that's not necessarily true because of margin borrowing.
Yeah.
So the actual assumption is,
Thank you.
the actual assumption is that they're able to borrow at the same rate, and that's a conservative assumption. Other questions? It was focused in on your, it's glad that the hair's growing around the mustache, makes it less conspicuous. Yeah.
So why would a stock price increase immediately when plans for like expanding a new production facility
Okay.
instead of gradually?
Okay, so let's think about this. If the word comes out that you are going to do something that is going to increase the value of the firm, and the people are 100% sure that that's going to happen, what are they immediately going to do to the stock price?
Rise.
They're going to bid it up to that new level, right?
What happens if it's false?
So sometimes what we see is upon announcement that it'll only rise 60%. So for example, my favorite example is mergers and acquisitions. In order for me to get you to sell me your shares of a firm, I have to offer you a premium. And so I'm going to offer you an extra $10 per share. But what happens as soon as I announce that? In theory, if this is a done deal, the share price of the target should immediately jump by $10, right? Oftentimes what we see is that it only jumps by 6. And why would that be? Because the market is placing a probability of 60% on that actually going through. Does that make sense? Now, on the NPV thing, if I announce something and my stock price, if I announce, let's think of something stupid people recently did. Let's say I announce I'm going to open up a new crypto exchange. Or I'm going to put all my money into crypto exchanges. What should happen to my stock price? It should immediately go down because what I'm undertaking is a negative NPV project. And so we can actually figure out what the market thinks is the NPV of our project. Let me finish this thought and then I'll get back to you. If I say I'm going to build a new electric car plant and I think the NPV is $10 million, but when I announce that, the share price, the market value of the equity only goes up $5 million, what does it say about my calculation of the NPV? I'm probably a bit rosy compared to what the market thinks. By the way, who do you think is more likely to be right? The market or one dude? Yeah, the market. And in fact, one of the things that we talk about is the hubris hypothesis. One of the things that makes these managers go out and buy other firms or engage in projects because they think that they're freaking great, right? By the way, how many humble CEOs do you think there are? It's a rare cat indeed, right? 2.5. Okay, just like the number of children in the average American family when I grew up. I knew a lot of half kids. They weren't that bad. Okay, now back to your other question.
So say like news is released or whatever.
Uh-huh.
How would the market know to what extent the price should jump?
Oh, exactly. So here's the neat thing about the market. It aggregates all of the information everybody has about this. And so you may think it's going to go up, or the shares are going to go up $10. And so you buy. Someone else may think it's only going to go up $2, so they buy. But the buying, when you aggregate it all together, it's going to push that share price up to like the wisdom of the crowd's number, right? So if you had to guess, so we have an opinion poll, and 70% of people think something is a bad idea compared to the president thinking it's a good idea. Which is more likely correct? You going to take the 210 million people or the one dude? Right? Does that make sense? I could tell you about, and the thing is, the people in the market, do the individual people in the market have to have superior information compared to the CEO? No. What we have to do is say that when we put all your information together, that then it is superior to that of the CEO. So I have a little bit of information what goes on here at the university. I have a little bit of information. But if you took the information that I have and you put it together with the information from all the professors across campus, do you think that it might be that we had more information amongst us than Cliff Smart has on his own? Cliff Smart's our president, in case you didn't know that, right? So that's the whole wisdom of the crowd's idea. And it's when we all jump in to buy, we're going to buy the appropriate amount of shares that's going to push the share price up to where it's going to be, the increase is going to be basically the amount of the net present value of that investment. Now, is it always exactly accurate? No. It's a swag. It's the expected value, right? So if you wanted to know what the best guess of an the best NPV guess for a project that's just been announced, look at the increment in the market value of the equity. Because whatever that market value of the equity goes up by, that's what the crowd thinks that the expected value of that NPV is. And if the share price went down, what does that mean? the expected NPV is negative. And if the NPV of a project is negative, what should we be doing with it? Rejecting it, right? We should be rejecting all negative NPV projects. And so if you're the CEO of the firm and you announce that tomorrow we're going to stop making internal combustion engines and we're going to go entirely electric, and your stock price immediately tanks, what should you do? Yeah, you should change your mind. You should say, wow, everyone has made it clear to us that this is a bad move. We're rescinding that decision. How often do you think that happens, that they rescind a decision? Never. Why? Pride. Yeah, look at that guy. Oh my goodness. He does stuff, stock price goes down, does he care? No. Now, to be fair, he has said from the very beginning, he is not in line with the goal of financial management.
No.
He's got one goal for Tesla, and that is to make electric cars mainstream. So if you're a shareholder with him, he's already told you he's not going to be acting in accordance with your best wishes, with your interests. Questions?